evening, everyone. I'm Chris Stover from the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs, which is a joint initiative of the Atlantic School of Theology and St. Mary's University. And on behalf of our board, I'd like to welcome you here this evening and thank you for coming for tonight's presentation. The St. Mary's University Philosophy Department's annual lecture in public philosophy is something that we've done for the second year in a row now, beginning with the department chair last year, John McKinnon, and this year now we have the new chair, Mark Mercer, who I'll introduce for you in a minute. But before I get to that, there's just a couple of things I wanted to mention. In this room, again on October 21st, CCEPA hosts its annual lecture, and this year we feature Mark Tewksbury, who will be talking about fair play ethics in sport. And on November 9th, at Alumni Hall at the University of King's College, CCEPA will join with the Situating Science Knowledge Cluster, the Science Media Centre of Canada, and Genome Atlantic to launch the first of a 6-part series entitled Science and Its Publics. And on November 1st, CCEPA joins with the Atlantic Leadership Development Institute and the Dalhousie Department of Continuing Education to present Inuit leader Mary Simon. I hope you can join us for some of those stimulating discussions. On your chairs as you came in, you might have noticed an evaluation form. CCEPA really values your feedback, so if you could take a minute before you leave tonight to fill that out, we would greatly appreciate that. And if you could now join me in a warm welcome for the chair of the philosophy department at St. Mary's University, Dr. Mark Mercer.
Thank you, Chris. In a moment, I'll introduce Todd Calder, who will then introduce Claudia Card, tonight's lecturer in public philosophy. Right now, I'd like to tell you a little bit about the annual lecture in public philosophy and to thank the people in the groups who have made tonight and the series possible. The annual lecture is due to the inspiration and the generosity of Rowland Marshall, a retired member of the St. Mary's Department of Philosophy. Rowland had noticed that many philosophers had much of interest and importance to say to people generally about ethics, but also about science, religion, the nature and possibility of inquiry and understanding, all topics that everybody thinks about, at least now and then. But public discussion of these matters, Rowland noticed, was very rarely philosophical. There appeared to be two reasons for this. One, philosophers were writing mainly for each other. Philosophers were writing mainly for each other in essays and books that only other philosophers dared to open. Two, there were few venues that were open to philosophers who wanted to reach a wider audience. The lecture series in public philosophy is Rowland's solution to both of these problems. By creating a venue for philosophers to address the public on matters of general interest, philosophers would be encouraged to find voices in which they could speak to the public. Rowland's idea seems to be working. The series is in its 7th year now, and it's become an important event in many of our calendars. This year's lecture in public philosophy is co-sponsored by the Department of Philosophy at St. Mary's and the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs, CCEPA. John McKinnon, the former chair of the department, and Chris Stover at CCEPA are to be thanked for their hard work. We've received additional support from the Rowland Marshall Public Philosophy Lecture Fund, from the Visiting Speakers Committee at St. Mary's, thank you, Tony Charles, the chair of the committee, from the Office of the President, thank you, Colin Dodds, and from the Office of the Dean of Arts, thank you, Esther Enns. I'd like to mention the table at the back with the CCEPA CDs on it, and also the table out in the foyer where the bookstore is offering copies of Claudia Card's book for sale. Our agenda tonight looks like this. I'm about to introduce Todd. Todd will introduce Dr. Card. Dr. Card will speak. We'll have a question and answer session. Todd will then make a few final remarks, and then we'll go to the foyer for wine and cheese and informal discussion. Todd Calder is our most recent permanent addition to the philosophy department at St. Mary's. As a matter of fact, he began 1 September, or was it 1 August? 1 September, so he's brand new here. Not really. He's been associated with the department for a couple of years, He arrived a couple of years ago as a sessional lecturer and then was around last year. And we're privileged to have been able to hire him as a tenure-track professor beginning this year. Todd met Claudia Card in 2002 at a conference and was fascinated by her work and took up the topic of evil himself and has been writing and publishing on that topic. From 2005 to 2007, Todd was a postdoctoral fellow working with Claudia Card at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He knows her work quite well and has developed it, extended it, and talks about evil in his own work. So, Todd Calder.
Thank you. It's a real pleasure to introduce your speaker this evening, Claudia Card. Claudia Card is the Emma Goldman Professor of Philosophy at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she teaches and does research in ethics and social philosophy. She's also an affiliate professor of Jewish studies, LGBT studies, women's studies, and environmental studies. Dr. Card studied under John Rawls at Harvard University some time ago and wrote a PhD dissertation on punishment and retribution. She's since written over 100 articles, journal articles, and some very influential books on feminist ethics, moral luck, evil, and atrocity. Some of her recent books include Genocide's Aftermath, The Cambridge Companion to Simone de Beauvoir, The Atrocity Paradigm, and The Unnatural Lottery. She's currently working on a new book on evil called Surviving Evils. And she's just finished a book that she has on display outside the auditorium called Confronting Evils, Terrorism, Torture, and Genocide. I've personally admired Claudia's work, as Mark has mentioned, for many years, and I think we're very happy and lucky to have her here. So please welcome Dr. Card.
Thank you, Todd, and thank you for inviting me to be your speaker tonight. I'm very honored to be here. The talk I'm about to give you will give you a taste of what goes on in that book out on the table called Confronting Evils, Terrorism, Torture, and Genocide. I begin with a quote from John Keats, who has written at least 2 books on evil. He says, "A morally inexcusable action may fall anywhere on a continuum from culpable ignorance to weakness to deliberately and knowingly doing evil for its own sake. Terrorism, torture, and genocide are today's paradigms of evil. Each has also been itself a response to perceived or threatened evils. A motivation for my work on evils is the hope that atrocity victims can learn to respond without doing further evil and model instead humanitarian values." The concept of evil admittedly has a dismal and continuing history of abuse as a club and a rallying tool that can stir up mass hatreds. Many worried, for example, when George W. Bush labeled Iran, Iraq, and North Korea an axis of evil, following the precedent of Ronald Reagan, who had labeled the Soviet Union an evil empire in 1983. Yet I'm not persuaded to abandon the concept of evil. My concern, though, is not to put labels on people or countries or axes, but to identify evil deeds, practices, and institutions. The project of my first book on evil, The Atrocity Paradigm, was to develop a secular conception of evils that captures the major atrocities of my lifetime. Today's talk modifies that theory, and in doing so, improves its application to social practices and other structural evils. My intent is to articulate a conception of evil that is less vulnerable to political abuse and is potentially helpful for constraining responses to atrocities. I begin with a review of my theory as presented in the atrocity paradigm. There, I define evils as reasonably foreseeable, intolerable harms produced by culpable wrongdoing. On that view, evils have two irreducibly distinct components, a harm component and an agency component, the culpable wrongdoing. Harm to victims, rather than perpetrators' motives, is what distinguishes evils from lesser wrongs. Evildoers need not be evil people. In 2002, just after the atrocity paradigm was published, on a radio call-in show, callers asked if I thought Saddam Hussein was evil, or George Bush. Few asked whether I thought this or that deed or practice an evil, but that's my focus, on deeds, institutions, practices, evils, plural. Two tasks guide my inquiries. The first task is to clarify differences between evils and lesser wrongs. Marcus Singer writes that evil, used precisely, is the worst possible term of opprobrium imaginable. What underlies that opprobrium? Philosophers have tended not to distinguish evils from lesser wrongs, but tend to refer loosely to anything bad or wrong as an evil. Yet outside academic philosophy, evil carries that emotive load that Singer notices. Genocide is an evil, so is premeditated murder. Petty theft is not, nor is ordinary tax evasion. Why distinguish evils from lesser wrongs? There are many reasons. One is to set priorities when resources are limited for preventing wrongs and repairing harms. Another reason, more interesting to me now, is to limit forms of defense against and retaliation for atrocities perpetrated or threatened by others, to rule out what is inhumane, degrading, or incompatible with democratic values. Inhumane responses by governments jeopardize the possibility of post-conflict peaceful coexistence and undermine the confidence of a people in their governments. Inhumane responses tend to be sufficiently shocking that those in power are tempted to maintain secrecy around them. That secrecy jeopardizes accountability and procedural justice and results in an improperly informed electorate. A second task guiding my inquiries is to rehabilitate the concept of evil in the face of widespread skepticism regarding its worth. Three myths facilitate the political abuse of the concept of evil. One is that evildoers are monstrous and cannot be reasoned with. Related is the Manichaean fantasy that humanity can be divided into the good, most of us, or on some views, an elect few of us, and them, the rest. A third myth is that evil is a metaphysical force that possesses some individuals. Given the harm done by such myths, it is fair to ask, why retain the concept of evil at all? My first response is that the myths themselves have been instrumental in the perpetration of evils, from the Inquisition to 9/11. To sustain that judgment, it is necessary to make sense of evil independently of the myths. And so my second response is that evil can be demythologized. A demythologized understanding is needed for creative thinking about how to respond with as much honor as possible to the worst wrongs of which humanity is capable. My secular approach to evil mediates between Stoicism and Epicureanism, two very ancient traditions. Stoicism takes evil to reside solely in wrongful intentions. Epicureanism takes it to reside solely in the experience of harm. Evils, on my analysis, have a Stoic component and an Epicurean component, neither reducible to the other. Intolerable harm, the Epicurean component, deprives victims of basics ordinarily needed to make a life or a death decent. Intolerable here is a normative concept. It refers not to what individuals cannot in fact tolerate, but to what a decent life cannot include. That is not entirely subjective. even if what is worth tolerating is somewhat relative to time and place, available resources, available knowledge, and so forth. Examples of intolerable harm are lack of access to non-toxic food, water, or air, lack of freedom from prolonged and severe pain, humiliation, or debilitating fear, prolonged inability to move one's limbs, lack of effective bonds with others, and the inability to make choices and act on at least some of them effectively. Evils rob us of these things. Lesser wrongs do less serious harm, if any harm at all. The motives, however, of lesser wrongs and evils are often the same: greed or impatience, for example. This analysis still seems to me a good beginning. I did not expect my theory, abstractly considered, to be controversial. Everything interesting, I thought, would lie in the interpretations of culpable wrongdoing, intolerable harm, and reasonable foreseeability. Yet an aspect of the theory has been controversial, and for good reason. The theory, as so far stated, did not capture well the collectively perpetrated evils of social practices, institutions, and other social structures, including many atrocities that are my own paradigms of evil. Those paradigms include the Holocaust, carpet bombings of civilians in World War II, and the Tuskegee syphilis experiments, for example. And so, both the problem of structural evils and my reflections on how to avoid doing evil in responding to atrocities led me to certain revisions in the atrocity theory of evils. Reflecting on the temptations of a potential perpetrator of evils led me to pay more attention to the agency component of an evil, and that led me in turn to a new view of the later work of Hannah Arendt and of the famous experiments in social psychology of Stanley Milgram and Philip Zimbardo. The work of these three thinkers had initially confirmed me in the idea that evils differ from lesser wrongs only in their harmfulness, not in their agency. I no longer find that view adequate, nor do I think it's the right conclusion to draw from their work. What is shocking about evils is not just the harm they do, but the utter lack of any moral excuse for it. None of these thinkers comment on that fact, and they might not agree with me, although I suspect Arendt would. But I find it a common element of the disturbing choices they studied. The myths that evildoers must be monsters and that the human race can be divided into the good and the evil take a powerful hit in the later writings of Arendt and in the well-known experiments of Milgram and Zimbardo. The Milgram obedience experiments and Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment are widely cited in support of Arendt's controversial observation regarding, and I quote her, the fearsome word and thought-defying banality of evil, which concludes the last chapter of her book on the 1961 trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem for crimes against the Jewish people. These three thinkers are often misunderstood as offering hypotheses about evil in general, but their focus is more specific: the monstrous deeds of people who are not monsters. None of them claims, nor do they imply, that no one is monstrous. But they need not be read as holding that there is an Eichmann in all of us either. Clearly not Arendt's view, although it might be Zimbardo's. The point they succeed in establishing is more modest, namely that one need not be deeply vicious or a freak of nature to do monstrous deeds. Listening to Eichmann at his trial and reporting on his conversation and his last words, Arendt was taken aback by his superficiality. His speech was trite. He utterly failed to consider the perspectives of his victims. Her diagnosis of what underlay his willingness to plan and coordinate trains to the death camps was that he never learned to think. He seemed unable to put two and two together morally for himself, although he was innovative in devising means to ends. The failure to think does not distinguish him from many bureaucrats who never become criminals. In a morally less demanding political climate, he might have led an unremarkable life. Looking at the Milgram and Zimbardo experiments and the case of Eichmann, I was struck initially by the similarity of motives from which people do evils and motives from which they do lesser wrongs. I concluded that motives are not what define the differences between evils and lesser wrongs. Rather, what distinguishes evils is the intolerable harm they do. I still find a lot of truth in that view, but I now think it not the whole truth about evils. What strikes me now, in addition, is a certain contrast between the agency exhibited by Eichmann, as well as most of Milgram's subjects and most of Zimbardo's guards, on the one hand, and the agency, on the other hand, of many less serious wrongs, such as lying to protect someone against undeserved harm. For such a lie, there is at least a good reason, one that carries moral weight, although, let us suppose, not enough to justify the lie, all things considered. But subjects who thought they were inflicting severe shocks in Milgram's experiments and Zimbardo's guards who abused prisoners had no moral excuse for their choices, no comparably good reason. It is true that their motives are not what stand out. What stands out for me is the lack of any moral excuse, given what they knew or had reason to believe about the harm they were being asked to do in Milgram's experiments or permitted to do in Zimbardo's. Their culpability is unmitigated by any diminished capacity or any partly justifying reason. They had reasons, to be sure, but those reasons do not begin to justify their choices. To elucidate further, I will review briefly those experiments and then clarify what I mean by no moral excuse. Milgram's experiments were motivated by his desire to understand how so many citizens of the Third Reich, from unskilled workers and housewives to educators, lawyers, and doctors, became complicit in the Holocaust. He asked people in advance of his experiments how many they thought would obey requests by an authority to do something they could foresee would inflict intolerable, even potentially fatal, harm. He and they were astonished to learn from the experiments that, in fact, the number was not the tiny fraction they had anticipated, but roughly 2/3 of the subjects who were tested. Milgram's subjects were actually given conflicting information. He told them the increasingly severe shocks, as punishment for the learner's wrong answers, would cause the learner no permanent harm. At the same time, the highest level of shock was clearly marked danger, and the responses of yells, pleas to stop, and eventually no audible response from the so-called learner at the higher shock levels sent a message incompatible with Milgram's assurance. And so the experiment offered an interesting test of Arendt's hypothesis regarding thinking. Philip Zimbardo was a high school classmate of Milgram, later briefly his colleague at Yale. Zimbardo designed an experiment carried out in August 1971 that tested whether it was even necessary to tell people to inflict harm once they occupied a role giving them authority and power to do it with impunity. His results surprised everyone also. Zimbardo's book, The Lucifer Effect, which was published in 2007, describes the Stanford prison experiment in a level of detail not published previously. In a simulated prison in the basement of a Stanford University building, some subjects played prisoners and others guards. They were given no scripts, only a role. Guards had no specific instructions on what to say or do, except not to use physical violence, an instruction not altogether respected. They were so hard on prisoners that the experiment, originally planned for 2 weeks, had to be terminated on day 6. 2 prisoners were so stressed they had to be released earlier, one on day 2. A film based on the Stanford prison experiment has been viewed by military personnel concerned to eliminate the sorts of abuse at Abu Ghraib, documented by the International Committee of the Red Cross in 2004. Milgram and Zimbardo are social psychologists. Their philosophical speculations are not what interest me. One need not conclude, for example, that good people become evil simply by being put under stress, confronted with authorities' expectations, or assigned a role giving them authority and power to do as they will. The accounts of applicant screening offer no evidence that those selected for the experiments were good people, only that they had no known histories of violence or other conspicuous abnormality. Still, those experiments remain breathtaking for the incontrovertible evidence they offer that more people than most of us would have thought are easily induced to inflict intolerable harm on others without excuse. That is, without duress and without any morally defensible reason. In short, that many are easily induced to do evil. It is the lack of a morally defensible reason in those who kept pushing the lever or abusing prisoners that stands out for me now as I review those experiments. In lesser wrongs, either there is no reasonably foreseeable, intolerable harm, or the agent willing to inflict it has some good, morally defensible, that is, reason. By a morally defensible reason, I mean some reason that counts morally in favor of the deed, even if on balance other considerations outweigh it. The choices of the abusive guards and of the lever pushers who did not quit were morally inexcusable. That is what is shocking, pun intended, not just their willingness to inflict great harm. No good reasons mitigate their choices. That an experimenter says to do it is not a good reason to inflict, for the sake of science, what you have reason to believe is a potentially fatal shock. That you can do so with impunity is not a good reason to abuse defenseless others who are at your mercy. Those reasons are not simply insufficient, they carry no moral weight. Some who are as persuaded as I am by Arendt, Milgram, and Zimbardo that many more people than one might have thought can easily become complicit in atrocities part company with me over the judgment that atrocities are evils. An alternative approach denies that they are evils just because the perpetrators are not monsters. Many worry that evil is a dangerous idea because it demonizes perpetrators, or they think it serves those Manichaean tendencies to bifurcate the world into us and them. Wielded ideologically, judgments of evil can feed hatreds that lead to atrocities rather than discouraging atrocities. For such reasons, some refuse to describe even atrocities as evils. What can one say? All of those concerns are valid. Yet my approach is to begin from the premise that atrocities are paradigmatic evils. By that, I mean that they are the least controversial instances of evils. If they are not evils, I cannot imagine what would be. My hypothesis is that scrutiny of real atrocities and what they do to victims can yield insight into what evils really are, and thereby demythologize the concept. Consider the following analogy with witchcraft during the Renaissance in Western Europe. One approach, the commonest today, begins by accepting conceptions of witches articulated by the mortal enemies of the women who for centuries were accused, tortured, tried, and turned over to secular authorities to be burnt. The 15th century Malleus Maleficarum, a tool of the Inquisition, defines witches as heretics who exercise strange powers in cooperation with demons. The next step is to deny, on the ground that there never were any demons, that there ever were any witches. Witches, so understood, perform real magic, defy laws of nature, copulate with demons, use demonic powers to kill fetuses in the womb, make men impotent, make pain disappear, and so on. On this view, the witch-burning episode was a colossal mistake, a product of scientific naivete, like the belief in unicorns, only not so harmless. An alternative approach, espoused by radical feminists, demythologizes witchcraft by inquiring into the actual practices of women burnt as witches. Were they skilled in the use of anesthetic herbs? Did they perform abortions and prescribe contraceptives? Did they know how to promote healings that, of course, have scientific explanations? Did they engage in activities that are currently the prerogative of licensed physicians, but that could well have appeared to observers then to be magical, especially when engaged in by illiterate practitioners? This approach begins from the premise that the women burnt as witches are paradigms of what it is to be a witch. To understand witchcraft, we do well to look at who they really were and what they really did, and not to take unquestioned the definitions put forward by their mortal enemies. On this approach, the witch burnings raise moral questions buried by the other approach. Did witches do grave harm? If not, why were so many resources devoted to hunting them down, torturing them, trying them, and burning them? Was their independence from male control a problem? What kinds of social services did they perform? Can we learn anything valuable from studying witchcraft? If witchcraft is impossible, if it is pure mythology, these are not genuine questions. There's nothing to study but the delusions of the accusers and judges of pitiable women. Demythologizing evil requires us to examine paradigmatic evils, as demythologizing witchcraft requires us to examine paradigmatic witches. Paradigmatic evils on my list include, in addition to those already mentioned, the massacre at Wounded Knee, the Mountain Meadows massacre, medical experiments of Japanese military Unit 731, the My Lai massacre, and the Cambodian genocide. Whatever such atrocities really are, that is what evil really is. But if there are no evils, the question how to avoid doing evil in response is as much a pseudo-question as are many questions about witchcraft for those who deny that witches ever existed. Finally, my atrocity theory avoids reifying evil as any kind of metaphysical force or demon. Evil personified as a demon or reified as a force is not to be reasoned with or understood. We need only destroy it, if possible, or defeat it. Demons are malevolent through and through, never ambivalent or changeable, literally inhuman. Evil on the atrocity paradigm wears a human face. Atrocities are perpetrated by agents who have epistemological limitations and emotional attachments. They are ambivalent, deluded, changeable, fickle. No moral excuse does not mean no humanly understandable reasons. This, in brief, is evil demythologized. Evil is at least as intelligible as goodness. And if we acknowledge human freedom in a very robust sense, we have to grant that there are limits to what we can understand of both good and evil in human conduct. I turn now to revisions of my theory. As my colleague in the history department, Alfred McCoy, who was interviewed in that wonderful documentary called Taxi to the Dark Side, as he put it, Milgram's obedience experiments taught the United States intelligence agencies an interesting lesson about who can be trained to become a torturer. I have that lesson well in mind in modifying my account of evils. My most basic modification substitutes inexcusable wrongs for culpable wrongdoing in the analysis of evil, so that the revised definition is: evils are reasonably foreseeable, intolerable harms produced by inexcusable wrongs. This definition preserves culpability in the evil deeds of individuals and at the same time allows a much improved account of evil in institutions, where individuals need not be culpable for resulting harms. Evils lack excuses of two kinds. One kind pleads reduced responsibility or even no responsibility. Aristotle divided such excuses into those based on compulsion and those based on ignorance. They apply not only to individuals, but to organizations and corporations to the extent that they too can act. But they do not apply to social practices, which are not agents and so cannot have diminished capacity to act. Compulsion and ignorance diminish or remove responsibility. Because this kind of excuse focuses on the ontology of agency, that is, on whether moral agency even exists in a particular case, I call it a metaphysical excuse. A second kind of excuse, more interesting for understanding evil, mitigates culpability without reducing responsibility. Rather, its argument is that there was a morally appropriate and defensible reason in favor of the deed or practice, a reason that carries moral weight, even though not enough to justify the deed or practice on the whole. What is justifiable on the whole needs no excuse. Further, a reason that carries moral weight in some circumstances, for some kinds of deeds, may lack moral weight in other circumstances or for other kinds of deeds. Or its moral weight may be so negligible that we do not significantly distort matters by saying that it carries none. For example, Eichmann's wanting promotions and recognition for his organizational and negotiating skills do not begin to justify what he did to try to earn promotions, although wanting promotions might be sufficient in other circumstances and for other jobs to justify doing one's job well. Evils also lack this kind of excuse, which can apply to practices as well. Practices can be indefensible, for even though they are not agents, they are normative, and so are appropriate objects of evaluation, criticism, or defense. They can even be culpable, that is, faulty, whether or not anyone is to blame. To contrast this kind of excuse with metaphysical excuses, I call it a moral excuse. Its focus is the morality, more specifically the moral defensibility of a deed, practice, or institution. For a moral excuse, it is not sufficient that the agent thinks there is a good reason. There must be one, and it must be the agent's reason, a reason defensible on reflection and in terms of moral values. A good goal is not enough to provide a good reason for just any means taken to achieve it. The means must be morally defensible also. A second modification that I've made in the atrocity theory after changing culpable to inexcusable is to cease contrasting evils with ordinary wrongs. Taking atrocities as paradigms made that contrast natural, as many atrocities are truly extraordinary. But to contrast evils with ordinary wrongs is to imply that evils are uncommon. I do not believe they are. I never really thought so. And so I now make a point of saying lesser wrongs instead of ordinary wrongs. The low-profile terrorism and torture that are routine under oppressive regimes, in racist environments, and in families devastated by domestic violence have made me cautious about equating grave with extraordinary. When an evil is common, it is easy for many not to perceive it as an evil. I will consider why shortly. A third modification that I've made in the atrocity theory is a more nuanced account of evil in practices and institutions. On my new definition of evil, evil in institutions or practices does not imply culpability in participants. They can be culpable, but that is a further matter. That an evil practice lacks moral excuse means only that there are no good moral reasons in its favor. It is morally indefensible. Three things, at least, can be indefensible in an institution: the rules that structure it, the way the rules are administered, and the often unanticipated ways that rules can work together to produce intolerable harms, often as a result of piecemeal change in the institution. An institution or practice can embody all three kinds. Whether an institution is evil itself depends on whether the evils it contains can realistically be eliminated without destroying it. I turn next to what it means to say of a wrong that it is morally inexcusable, and to the question whether that idea makes monsters of evildoers after all. Lack of excuse has different implications for individual wrongs and institutional wrongs. I begin with institutional wrongs. Institutions and social practices are defined and structured by rules. A rule is morally inexcusable when it is not defensible, even partly, from a moral point of view. It is evil when its implementation produces reasonably foreseeable, intolerable harm. We can internalize rules without being aware of it. To use H.L.A. Hart's distinction, one of my favorite philosophers of law, between internal and external aspects of rules, the rules that we learn and apply without being aware of having done so still have an internal aspect when they guide our conduct as opposed to simply describing regularities in our behavior. If it is not reasonable to expect the internalizers of evil rules to appreciate at a particular time that they have done so, there may be no individual culpability at that time. The definition of evils in the atrocity paradigm, this is my first evil book, could not accommodate the point that institutional evils do not imply individual culpability. The reason why I originally treated culpability as partly definitive of evils was in order to distinguish evils from natural catastrophes. But indefensibility also serves to distinguish the harms of evils from those of natural catastrophes, as defensibility is inapplicable to natural catastrophes. When a deed is inexcusable, morally and metaphysically, the doer's culpability is unmitigated. That sounds extreme. And so the question naturally arises whether inexcusability makes monsters of perpetrators after all. I think not, for the following reason. That a fully responsible agent lacks a morally acceptable reason does not imply that the agent is weird, unintelligible, inhuman, or even unamenable to rational persuasion. Not all of the ordinary reasons we have for what we do are moral reasons or defensible in terms of moral values. Some humanly understandable explanations, such as laziness, apathy, or even self-interest, or a desire for approval, do not begin to justify certain choices morally or lower the bar of expectation. Self-interest or a desire for approval often suffice to justify deeds that require no moral defense, but those reasons tend to lack weight for deeds that do. Whether Milgram's and Zimbardo's experiments showed anything significant about evil depends on whether participants had morally defensible reasons for their choices. My conclusion from the accounts the experimenters provide is that Milgram's subjects who kept pressing the lever and Zimbardo's abusive guards did not. They had reasons, but those reasons do not amount to even a partial justification. They explain without mitigating. That is why the experiment's results are so appalling. In Milgram's subject, we can suppose that the reasons were he said to do it, and he said it wouldn't do any permanent harm. That might do from an adolescent or an illiterate. But these were literate adults who had reason to question what Milgram had told them. In Zimbardo's abusive guards, we may suppose the reasons were, I felt like it, it was fun, besides it was only an experiment. Yet they could see up close and personal that the stress they were inflicting was no act, especially given the release of 2 prisoners. Given those facts, such reasons lack justificatory force. It is not that those reasons are not good enough. Morally speaking, they are no good at all. In Arendt's sense, these subjects were not thinking. Here's an example from history, not an experiment. The desire for Lebensraum, living space, for the German people did not begin to justify the Third Reich's forcibly removing and concentrating, let alone slaughtering, inhabitants of Poland and other countries who were not ethnic Germans. Desire for Lebensraum was a reason, an explanation, but it carried no moral weight. The policy was morally inexcusable. Inexcusable wrongs are frequently matters of succumbing to temptation, failing to think, failing to identify and examine assumptions, or caving to peer pressure. These are weaknesses, not ordinarily malevolent. Temptations and pressures can excuse, but not always. For normal adults, under circumstances that are not extreme, temptations of greed do not excuse. Neither does fear of losing the esteem of those whose esteem is based on indefensible values. One might object that if all evils are inexcusable, that is, unmitigated, then all evildoers must be equally culpable, equally blameworthy, which is implausible. A torturer who does it reluctantly for money, doing no more harm than necessary to get paid, is less reprehensible than one who does it enthusiastically with no scruples about limits. Yet, if the wrongs are equally unmitigated, does that not imply that both torturers are equally culpable, deserving equal blame? Equally culpable in one sense, yes, but not in a sense that justifies equal blame. One sense of equally culpable is equally responsible and thereby equally liable to blame. Another sense is liable to equal degrees of blame. Only in the first sense are the two torturers equally culpable. Evildoers are equal in what they lack, an excuse, but not in what they have, their reasons, faults, objectives, circumstances. That one could have had an even worse reason is not a mitigating factor. A less bad reason casts one in a less unfavorable light, but mitigation requires a good reason. Another way to put it is that absence of aggravation is not a mitigating factor. It seems obvious once stated that inexcusable deeds that do intolerable harm need not be uncommon. Why then can it also seem natural to contrast evils with ordinary wrongs? One reason is a legitimate concern not to weaken the force of judgments of evil by casual use. Admission that evils need not be extraordinary may seem to open the door to casual use. Yet an equally legitimate concern pulls in the opposite direction. We need to be alert to the evils of our own time and appreciate the dangers of our own complicity in them. What is extraordinary is not only noteworthy, but unusual, rare. Rarity is relative to context. What is rare in one context can be common in another. Under Stalin, ideologically motivated murder was not rare. Under the Third Reich, evil was the default. Even Plato did not protest slavery. Plato has Socrates castigate Euthyphro for being impious in taking his father to court for having allowed a slave to be left in the ditch to die. At no point does Socrates question the morality of slavery. Slavery was ubiquitous. What is extraordinary is not the existence of evils, but their recognition as evils by contemporaries. The danger of complacency regarding the status quo exists as much for us as it did for Plato. What makes a deed or practice evil is not its frequency, but its intolerable harm and the lack of moral excuse. That a deed or practice is morally grave is compatible with its being widespread, as slavery and torture have been. Aggravated rape and severe domestic violence are so common today that crisis workers in major cities across the United States put in long hours and shelters have insufficient beds. I am optimistic enough to think non-malevolent evils are probably commoner than malevolent ones, but they need not be less grave. They can do great harm and be difficult to prevent. Intoxication and text messaging, for example, while driving, increase the likelihood of fatal accidents. We all know this now. And yet, irresponsible cell phone usage, if not drunk driving, is widely tolerated. A deed's perceived frequency can interfere with the common recognition that it is evil. Here's how that may work. First, it is easy to imagine ourselves in the shoes of those who do what is commonly done. This is how we are socialized. We model ourselves after many significant others. Second, perpetrators are liable to an erroneous perception described by psychologist Roy F. Baumeister at Case Western Reserve as the magnitude gap. He cites studies that concluded that there's a gap between perpetrators' and victims' perceptions of the gravity of a wrong. Perpetrators tend to minimize the gravity of the wrongs they do. Victims tend to exaggerate the gravities of the wrongs they suffer. More specifically, it makes sense to me that we distort the element of an evil with which our acquaintance is less direct. Thus, perpetrators might tend especially to minimize the harm they do, which victims experience more directly. Victims might tend to exaggerate the reprehensibility of perpetrators' motives. When an evil becomes common, it is easy for observers to underestimate the harm if they take the perpetrator's perspective. The magnitude gap describes tendencies to opposing illusions and delusions made familiar to us from childhood. If we are well brought up, we are taught to attend to more than one side of a conflict. But some perspectives lack representation in dominant cultural traditions and media. A tendency to take up the perspectives of those well represented in a community makes us vulnerable to the illusion that their wrongs are not so bad. Awareness of that should serve as a caution. Philosophers trained as I was in the ordinary language tradition of analytic philosophy should be cautious about relying on what people say is or is not evil. We should form the habit of asking, which people? Whose voices, if any, are dominating the conversation? Many of us can recall having done inexcusable things, or we can recall that members of our families have. Not all morally inexcusable deeds are evils, only those that do intolerable harm. Yet some of us are just lucky. My father, a traveling salesman, drove 50 years with no seatbelt on increasingly congested highways. When he started driving, they didn't even have licenses. He advised his children to wear seatbelts, but never wore one himself. He consumed formidable quantities of alcohol daily, stopping at roadside taverns. To my knowledge, he did not kill or injure anyone. He was skilled. He'd been driving since he was 11. And he was lucky. Even after I was adult enough to know better, I did not try to dissuade him. Sometimes I drank with him. He was my father, and while he lived, I had no driver's license. Those are at best explanations, not excuses. Social psychologist Leonard Berkowitz reports that on a popular level, evils appear to observers to make no sense, and so evildoers are apt to appear non-rational. Often, when people judge a deed evil, they have a hard time imagining themselves capable of doing such a thing. That inability to understand may in reality reflect an unwillingness to imagine oneself in the shoes of an evildoer. But understanding or willingness to empathize do not make the difference between evils and lesser wrongs. What makes the difference is whether the doer could reasonably foresee intolerable harm and whether there was morally any excuse for the deed. An observer's difficulty in understanding makes sense in terms of the magnitude gap. In judging uncommon wrongs, many are apt to take the perspective of victims who see perpetrators as monsters. If they took the doer's perspective, they might be less apt to judge the deed an evil. But we may be reluctant to take a doer's perspective if we already appreciate that the harm is intolerable and that there is no excuse. Yet there are good reasons to take up the perspectives of potential perpetrators in whom we can recognize ourselves. Any of us can face temptations to inexcusable wrongs that do intolerable harm that is reasonably foreseeable, if only we look. If we think that impossible, we're less likely to look. To see myself as someone who might become capable of a deed is not necessarily to judge the deed or myself leniently. Illusions of the magnitude gap are not inevitable. We are most vulnerable to them when we take up a point of view without realizing what we are doing, for then we may fail to judge at all. I conclude with an illustration of the complexities of determining whether there is any excuse for supporting an institution despite the evils it is known to contain. The case I choose is the death penalty in the United States. In the atrocity paradigm, I proposed that institutions are evils when, first, it is reasonably foreseeable that their normal or correct operation will result in intolerably harmful injustice, and two, that individuals who have the power to abolish or alter those institutions culpably fail to do so. There is a serious problem with that analysis. We should be able to identify a practice as evil without knowing whether anybody has the power to change or abolish it at a given time. That a practice is evil is a reason to seek power to change or abolish it. My modified definition of evils, invoking inexcusability rather than culpability, allows us to identify evils in the rules that structure a practice without assuming that anyone yet has the power to change or abolish the practice. It also allows us to identify practices as not evils when they are to some extent morally defensible, even if no one has yet attempted the defense. A reason that supports a rule need not be one that anyone actually has. A rule is defensible in terms of reasons that could be given, whether anyone does or not. In this way, moral excuses for institutions or practices differ from moral excuses for individuals. To have a moral excuse, an individual must actually have a morally defensible reason. It does not suffice that the reason be conceivable. For an institution, it suffices that the reason be conceivable. The question then is whether there can be any excuse for supporting or tolerating an institution that contains morally indefensible practices. Can contemporary toleration of evils in a practice, or even toleration of an evil practice, be excusable or even justifiable as an improvement on prior practice, and so as a move in the direction of justice? John Rawls suggests in his book, A Theory of Justice, that slavery, although unjust, may have been tolerable at a certain point in history as a lesser injustice at a time when enslaving a conquered people enabled prisoner exchange, and so was an improvement from everyone's point of view over the prior practice of killing the conquered, that is, of genocide. His discussion actually suggests more than toleration. He imagines a case in which, and I quote him, city-states that previously had not taken prisoners of war but have always put captives to death, agree by treaty to hold prisoners as slaves instead. End of quote. Such a treaty would authorize slavery, not merely tolerate it. Slavery remains an evil, but supporting the treaty, even if wrong, is not a further evil, provided the empirically defensible belief that it effectively prevents a worse evil is a moral excuse. That is, a morally defensible reason for supporting the treaty. Signatories to the treaty are complicit in slavery, but it is misleading to say they participate in the practice if they are not slaveholders or traffickers. If signing the treaty is the only realistically available move toward more just social practice, perhaps signing is even justifiable, not simply excusable. It was also Rawls's view that the evils of slavery gave rise to a responsibility at the same time to work for better, that is, more just institutions. He did not claim that there was any obligation for the ancients to support such a treaty, even temporarily, but seems to leave it open that it might have been heroic for someone who objected to both genocide and slavery to refuse such a treaty, even as a progressive step. Whether to refuse both on principle is a question Rawls does not take up. A similar dilemma arises regarding the death penalty in the United States and the question whether to support as a progressive step the alternative of long-term imprisonment for the civil crime of murder. It is usually assumed without question that the death penalty is more severe. But many inmates suffer grave harms as irreversible as death, and some are killed. Prisons in the United States expose many inmates to rape or murder and to HIV and grave illnesses. Some die for lack of health care. Even when prisons are relatively humane, they rob lifers of the power to shape the rest of their lives meaningfully. Such concerns led John Stuart Mill, and in 1976, 35-year-old Gary Gilmore in Utah, to find life in prison a worse penalty than death, although Mill said he would support prison over death if there were significant chance of convicting the innocent. The main advantage of long-term imprisonment is that some reparation is sometimes possible to those who are wrongfully imprisoned, whereas it never is to those who are wrongfully executed. Abstractly, it is difficult to deny the existence of moral arguments for the death penalty. How can those who inexcusably take life complain if made to forfeit their own? In my view, they can't, but others can. Absence of a basis for offender complaint does not imply presence of a justification to impose the penalty. The retributive argument presupposes that the executed committed murder. It ignores wrongful convictions. Innocent errors, of course, are not evils, although legislation that ignores them may be. But worse, it is foreseeable that in a society with a burgeoning criminal caseload, normal implementation of the rules of criminal justice will frequently result in wrongful convictions that are not errors, but are based in corrupt judgment, inexcusably poor defenses, or abuses of prosecutorial discretion. When the consequence is death, those are evils. Is there any moral excuse for death sentences when such evils are reasonably foreseeable? What moral weight is carried by the retributive argument when the sentence can be imposed through inexcusable wrongs that undermine the value of a guilty verdict? If none, it appears that the death penalty in the United States is an evil, even if many who receive it deserve it. But is there a viable alternative that contains fewer, lesser, or even no evils? The most popular argument against the death penalty is that the threat of long-term imprisonment should suffice for the legitimate aim of deterring murder. That seems the alternative with the best chance of gaining support in the United States. The deterrence debates are not just empirical. No penalty deters 100%. Should suffice means is sufficient for an acceptable degree of deterrence. The normative acceptability of a degree of deterrence depends on its moral costs relative to alternatives. A moral cost of additional deterrence produced by the death penalty is the evil of irreparable injustice to those whose wrongful convictions are morally inexcusable. Moral costs of less deterrent penalties are the evils of murders that might not have been committed under a more deterrent penalty. Grant, for the sake of argument, the controversial claim that the death penalty is more deterrent. Proponents who rely on that argument should consider restricting the death penalty to murder for hire or for profit, which is where the deterrence argument is most plausible. Neither the death penalty nor long-term imprisonment is free of irreversible and intolerably harmful consequences. Innocent people are killed either way, but everyone does not run equal risks. Not all are equally equipped to defend themselves. The indigent, a largely involuntary minority, are more vulnerable to corruption in criminal justice because they cannot afford talented lawyers, and relatively invulnerable to murder for profit because they are indigent. The non-indigent, a larger and more voluntary group, are more vulnerable to murder for profit and less vulnerable to corruption in criminal justice because they can hire talented lawyers. Implicit in the deterrent defense of the death penalty appears to be the judgment that protection against murder for profit is worth the moral cost of convicting the indigent innocent. A consequentialist defense. More people would die evil deaths without the death penalty than under it. Like utilitarian arguments, it aggregates bad consequences, but here they are evils, not disutilities. The result is better protection for those who are not indigent, a morally irrelevant condition. Aggregating evils is not sufficient to decide the issue, and not only because of inequality in distributing protection. There is also the question whether support for either alternative makes a state complicit in the resulting evils. A state that backs a criminal justice system in which reasonably foreseeable corruption sends innocent people to death is complicit in those deaths because it knowingly authorizes the system. A less deterrent penalty would not, however, make the state complicit in murders committed by others who might not have killed had the penalty been death. I guess that's a controversial claim, but that's how it seems to me. Long-term imprisonment is not an authorization to kill. Substituting long-term imprisonment for the death penalty would still imply a choice to tolerate less protection from criminal justice against murder for profit or for hire, less, that is, for the non-indigent majority. The position of those who would substitute long-term imprisonment is analogous to that of those who would support enslavement over genocide. Because enslavement enables prisoner exchange, it is arguably less intolerably harmful. Because imprisonment enables prisoner exchange, because imprisonment enables some rectification in the case of wrongful convictions, imprisonment is arguably less intolerably harmful than the death penalty. Still, there are evils in both practices, knowing that we have a social responsibility to seek better alternatives. Were there a referendum, the heroic course might be to vote for neither. Yet one who is morally opposed to both might, with some justification, temporarily support long-term imprisonment as a move in the direction of justice if it appeared that the substitution would make more likely the eventual abandonment of both practices. The heroic choice of refusing to support either could be defended if it appeared doubtful that substituting long-term imprisonment would have that effect, or if there were even a good chance that it might make that result less likely. Perhaps that sort of entrenchment occurred with slavery. Writing enslavement into treaties may have made slavery harder to abolish. Many in the United States seem to find it as inconceivable to abolish both the death penalty and long-term imprisonment as it was to the ancients to abandon both genocide and slavery. Yet the European Union has set an example worth attending to. It has abolished not only the death penalty, but also long-term imprisonment for all but major human rights violations, such as crimes against humanity or grave breaches of international humanitarian law. To eliminate the evils of both penalties, the solution, people taken as they are and laws as they might be, seems to me abstractly clear. There's probably no way to eliminate inexcusable wrongdoing from criminal process short of eliminating criminal process, and no way to eliminate inexcusable criminal wrongdoing short of eliminating criminal law. If neither abolition is desirable and aggregating consequences is unjust, at least part of the solution must lie with upper limits of severity in criminal penalties. If no penalty imposed intolerable harm, then a wrongful conviction, however inexcusable, would not be an evil. Suppose the state were authorized to impose no criminal penalty more harmful than what anyone could be reasonably expected to endure in the case of a wrongful conviction. There are many ways to achieve that result, including shortening sentences and improving prison conditions. A cost might be a temporary increase in certain murders, but the scruple of not fighting evil by evil means requires foregoing certain defenses that might have been effective. By instituting a prohibition on cruel and unusual punishments, modern democracies choose to tolerate the risk of crimes by those who would be deterrable only by torture, such as drawing and quartering. Abolishing both the death penalty and long-term imprisonment for most crimes would be in line with that choice. It would not make the state complicit in the crimes of those deterrable by nothing short of inhumane penalties, but states do remain complicit in wrongful convictions that result from corruption in their criminal justice systems, just as Rawls's ancient treaty signers remained complicit in the evils of slavery. The treaty signers are at least supposed to have had the excuse of no better way, realistically available then, to eliminate the evils of genocide. It's more difficult to make the case that states supporting life imprisonment today have any excuse, given the example of the European Union. Thank you.
I have a question about the significance of harm and also the significance of choice in your account. It strikes me that there are some cases, though, they might be strange cases like The Matrix, where people do things that don't make anyone's life any worse off, per se, but they limit their ability to make choices and live meaningful lives in other ways. So you might think of a more realistic example would be like conspiracies. You could imagine a conspiracy to put a representative in power that nobody wanted in power, but makes the country much, much better, or something like that. And it strikes me to be an evil just because the way in which it limits somebody else's ability to form a meaningful life seems to me to be very significant, and in some cases the significance of harm just doesn't capture that well. So I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the significance.
Yes. The way I understand harm, severely limiting an individual's autonomy counts as a harm. I don't think of harm hedonistically. It doesn't have to be something that you are even aware of. Poison kills even when it tastes good. So that I think your point is very well taken. Thank you. Yeah.
I'd like to ask you a question about torture in its use in the world, and particularly in the case of Iraq. And I'd like to raise the issue of Michael Ignatiev's a well-known piece in the New York Times where he said that torture could be morally defensible in the case of, say, Iraq. And then several years later, after he was leader of the Liberal Party of Canada, he issued a retraction in the New York Times saying that he was mistaken. I'd like to ask you whether you think torture is ever justified in the course of war.
Thank you for that question. I have 2 chapters on torture in the book out there, and I take a hard line on that one. I think that torture is never justified in the course of war. And I argue this not a priori, but there are a lot of empirical aspects of my argument. And just to summarize a couple of the main points, I think that the arguments in favor of torture tend to assume that we know a lot more than we do, that we can control a lot more than we can, and they also tend to be extremely arrogant about the relative importance of the torturer's security from harm. So in the book, I have 2 chapters each on torture, terrorism, and genocide. I argue genocide is wrong by definition. It's the murder of a people, and it's part of the concept of murder. In the case of terrorism, I take the position it's conceivable that some acts that are considered terroristic might be justifiable, but terrorism is a very much more abstract concept, and its meaning is much more contested than that of torture. With torture, I think you can't argue that it's wrong by definition, but I still want to take the position that it is wrong to engage in torture in war. Yeah.
Thank you very much for that talk. I very enjoyed it. You featured quite heavily in my dissertation, so this is really exciting.
What are you writing on?
I actually wrote on the concept of oppression.
Oh, great.
Which is partly forming my question today, coming out of that. The notion of intolerable harm, there's something about it that I'm wondering if could more tolerable harms, could they collectively become intolerable?
That's a very good question, and I think the answer is yes. If you look at harms in isolation from their context, it can be like looking at one bar of the birdcage, and if you miss the social structure that in fact stunts the development of the people that it traps. So I think the answer to that question is yes. And by intolerable, I don't mean necessarily that it has to be felt as intolerable, but that it would not be part of a decent life. You know, it stifles the development of the people that it oppresses. Thank you.
Hi, Brad McRae. Thank you again. I've been reading a book called Dead Aid. And of course, we would say that what happened in 9/11 is evil. But when you look at what happened in Afghanistan and you look at the research in that book, they show that with different levels of income, how long a democracy is likely to last. And if their income per person is under $1,000, democracies only last less than 8 years on average. You can also correlate that with the Transparency Index, which shows how transparent or how corrupt a society is. It seems to me that we're caught, because if we stay in Afghanistan, it's evil. If we leave in Afghanistan, it's evil. And the research has shown that Afghanistan has gone from 2.5, which is very low on the Transparency Index, to now 1.1, which is even lower. What do we do? I mean, we can't, we've given women hope that they could have a better life, but we've supported a regime that's absolutely corrupt. So do you want to cut off your left hand or your right hand? So if you were President of the United States or Prime Minister of Canada, what would you do in Afghanistan?
You've identified a really difficult kind of problem where your alternatives are the result of prior bad decisions, and also where you're trying to do something that it's probably not within your power to do without a lot of cooperation from others. And I think some of the most difficult questions to answer are the ones where you're facing alternatives that wouldn't have existed except for prior evil doing. And there are probably not really clear answers to many of those questions. So I'm not directly answering your question, I'm just saying how hard it is.
Would you have any advice for Canada? Because the United States has been on average at war every 7 years, according to Thomas Friedman, which has gone up. Canada has been known as a peacekeeper, but unfortunately, I think, has followed the United States' lead. So what should we do as Canadians?
Well, I don't think there is a simple way to do about what that Canadians should do. I think that when somebody is being attacked by terrorists, that there needs to be international cooperation for how to respond, not just one nation deciding unilaterally what to do. That might suggest some things that Canada might do, but you know, what Canada should do is a very big question and probably should do different things about different issues.
Okay, the last part of this, if I might, is clearly, you know, what evil is what happened in 9/11.
Yeah.
And there seems to be almost a reverential aspect. I mean, it's horrible, but there's every year it's not celebrated, but it's commemorated. And yet there's an acceptance of the killing of innocent women, children, and civilians in Afghanistan.
I agree with you, there's too much acceptance of that. But that's my paradigm case of thinking of evil responses to evil. Torturing people in order to prevent more 9/11s is not the answer.
Okay, thank you.
I was wondering about the distinction that you made between some sorts of wrongs that are evil and others that you were calling lesser wrongs. Yes. And so it seems to me that, first of all, that suggests that any kind of a wrong that isn't evil is not as bad as, is less wrong as. It's a lesser wrong. Would that be correct?
Then that can mean different things, because an evil has two components. It's got the harm component, and then it's got the agency component that I've modified to be inexcusable wrongdoing. A lesser wrong may have an excuse. That's how it may be lesser. Or it may do harm that's not intolerable. That's how it might be lesser.
Okay. So the reason I ask that is because the real question I want to ask is about the differences in degree and in kind between evils and lesser wrongs. And so when you think of all sorts of lesser wrongs that could be committed, you give any two examples and we might say, well, that one's worse than that, and then find a third one, oh, that's somewhere in between the two, and we can almost come up with a continuum of degree of wrongness of wrongs. And so I'm wondering if the worst kind of wrong that is less than evil and the least kind of evil, whether there's anything you can say about the gap in degree of wrongness there might be. I know that sounds horribly mathematical.
No, it turns out that it's even more complex than that, because there are many dimensions along which one evil might be worse than another, and sometimes they're incommensurable. Sometimes there's no way to say, on balance, this is worse than that. If you look at just something like how do you measure pleasure and pain, there's intensity, there's duration, there's the probability, and whether it's irreversible, whether it's containable or not. And one evil may differ from another along one of these dimensions, but be similar in other respects. But more commonly, they're going to differ from each other along many of these dimensions. And there isn't a mathematical formula for summing it up. And there may be no need to sum it up.
Do you think then that there sometime might be a case where a lesser wrong is actually preferable to an evil? Sorry, an evil is preferable to a lesser wrong, if
no.
Given a situation where we would have to choose one or the other?
Offhand, I would say no. Are you thinking of an example?
No, I was just
thinking
if you thought there was one.
Right. I don't think
Thanks.
so. Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'd just like to say first off that I really like how you contrasted evil with like major institutions. I guess my question would have to be, what would your opinion be of the monetary system as a whole, inclusive of all of, like, there's religion and there's law, but and government, of course, and the capitalist ideals, but the monetary system as a whole, have you ever kind of wondering?
What do you mean by the monetary system?
The monetary system just being the use of money, just the way our money system works. So
I'm used to thinking of it as something that's become necessary. I mean, I suppose the alternative is barter, and to some extent that can exist alongside the money system. Is that what you're thinking?
Well, that's the thing, is a lot of people take the monetary system for granted, and they don't really realize where it comes from. But
I'm not sure that it is just one system either. There may be a plurality of monetary systems. The concept of money is interesting to think about. What counts as money? And I haven't thought enough about that. That's a very interesting question. Thank you.
Dr. Card, one of the things that puzzled me a little bit is we talked about evil acts, or you talked about evil acts, and not so much about people. But is there such a thing as a slippery slope? And you mentioned Adolf Eichmann. He didn't start off with an ultimate evil act. But is there an implication that people would start off with lesser evils and get on a slope, so to speak?
Oh yes, I think that's very often how someone who becomes a tyrant or a monster starts out, is with good intentions and with good goals, and much more focused on the goals than on the means used to achieve them. Yes, I mean, I don't want to deny that there are evil people. It's just that that's not what's motivating my work. Sure. And I think the way in which people become evil is often incremental. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Good question.
And don't forget, pardon? Yes, thanks very much, Claudia, for that interesting paper. And I think that we had a very fruitful discussion about the nature of evil and wrongdoing and the differences between them. There's a gift, is there? We would like to offer you this gift as part of our thanks for giving this talk here today.
Well, thank you.
Thanks very much. And there's more.
Oh my.
Not just one gift. There are several gifts.
It's going to be my birthday on September 30th. Really? This isn't like I'm getting a birthday present.
Okay. Thanks very much. Can we thank her again?